This session will be chaired by Ms. Tasnim Idris, Associate Director of Liberty Network. Unfortunately, Professor Shad Faruqi would not be able to attend our conference today due to urgent health condition. Let us pray for his speedy recovery. I would now pass the floor to Ms. Tasnim Idris. Please welcome to the stage.
Hello. Yeah. Welcome our esteemed guests to our first session of the Islamic Liberty Network 10th International Conference. I would like to welcome my esteemed guests for this session. Please proceed to the stage. So, my name is Tasnim Idris from Tunisia, and I am the Islamic Liberty Network Associate Director. I'm very happy to be chairing the very first session of this conference. Sadly, Dr. Salim Faruqi is not able to join us because of some health issues. Let's pray for his speedy recovery. I'm pleased to introduce my distinguished guests from this session. So, Ms. Amel Azzouz, she is from Tunisia, and she is the former Secretary of State. Her presentation is going to be about the future of democracy in Tunisia. Dr. Bijan Shaheen is Professor of Political Science at Hacettepe University in Turkey and Islamic Liberty Network Turkey Fellow. He's going to be talking about rule of law and democracy and in Turkey. Yes, that's very specific. We have Dr. Saeed Khan, Associate Professor at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. His presentation is going to be about can Muslims save democracy, Muslim minority communities resisting liberalism. Good luck with that. It's a very tough question. You can learn about our speakers in the booklets that you have in front of you. Trust me, they're much more than these short bios that I just provided. And this applies on our speakers. So this session will continue for the next hour and a half. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to present, and then the last 30 minutes will be dedicated to a Q&A session, and then we're going to proceed to the lunch break. So without further ado, let's begin. The floor is yours, Ms. Amel. Ladies first.
Okay, good morning. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you, ILN, for having me again here. Thank you, Ali Salman. Thank you, Tasneem. Thank you, everybody. So, unfortunately, I've been talking with Bijan a few minutes earlier, to start a conference on prosperity in the Muslim world with a broken democracy is a little bit, how can I say? Anyway, let's hope for lessons to be learned from this broken democracy. Anyway, maybe this is the organizers' idea by having me talking about this. So Tunisia's broken democracy, what is next? I was asked to focus on the future. In my introduction, I'd like to remind you, or as everybody or many of you may know, that Tunisia, there is a slide into autocracy, which is getting accelerated every single day, with President Qais Said's power grab, having all the powers, judiciary, executive, legislative, between his hands, with a clear assault on individual and collective liberties and freedoms. However, this presentation here does not seek to assess this democratic experiment. I'm not going to do this. 4 years earlier, when I came to ILN's conference in Jakarta, I spoke of that democracy. Today, my purpose is different. Just a brief account, I'll start with a brief account on this experience or experiment. Why? Just to provide a point of departure, because you cannot really think or talk about the future unless you see what happened exactly, but this doesn't need a lot of details. So I'll focus, or my focus will be on how the quest for democracy can be renewed in a not too distant future. That's my purpose, in a way, very, very briefly, because of time constraints. Okay. 10 years of experimenting with democracy. Of course, when I speak of Tunisia's decade of democracy, I can mention especially the outcomes on the constitutional, political, and electoral levels. You remember, those who've been here in Jakarta with ILN, remember I spoke about the achievement, constitutional achievement, and particularly with the freedom of religion, the freedom of belief. You remember that day I spoke at length about that. However, these are achievements. However, at the level of development, there is a poor developmental achievements. If you speak in Tunisia, we speak about the revolution's objectives. There are objectives, socio-economic and developmental and political. The political have been addressed, but not the socio-economic objectives. So there is an apparent, ostensible redistribution of power. There is a revolution, normally with revolutions, with even transitions and democratic or political transitions, we have a kind of redistribution of power, something which did not happen really in Tunisia, with the real power holders and the deep state maintaining their positions. Economic elite, security elite, administrative elite, the media, all of them, they've been working before 2011, before the revolution, and they continued to maintain their power after 2011. So, another problem during this decade is this kind of disconnection between political elite and the public and the masses. I think this is something which currently, it does happen in many experiences of transitions and changes. This disconnection between elites and masses, something happened like that happened in Tunisia. So political life among these elites, it transformed into a kind of war of positions among the elites themselves and private interests. There is a focus on private interests, on positions, but not on people's needs, on food on the table and people's needs. This is something which has been totally forgotten. So there is another specificity of Tunisia is what we call in Tunisia polarization, ideological. Maybe in other countries, Muslim countries, we have ethnic plurality, religious plurality, racial plurality. In Tunisia, we don't have that. We have a homogeneous society with just one language, one race, one religion, etc. But the problem is in the polarization is on ideology. So there is a clear division between Islamists or conservatives on one hand and secularists on the other. There is this persistence of this polarization in addition to what I myself call persistence of patrimonial governance, particularism, clientelism, informal practices, something which is very, very specific to many developing countries, not only the Arab or the Muslim countries. Yes, please. Outcomes of all of this, we have a strong disillusionment of people losing faith not only in the elites themselves, but also in democracy. That's the problem. So people lost faith in the political class. I will tell you afterwards why class. Elite at the beginning, but then the more they get disconnected with people, the more they become a class totally separate from the masses. So a disillusionment accentuated at that time by the COVID-19 health crisis. So we had a kind of unsustainable political and socio-economic situation, which led to, you all heard about the coup d'etat, which I do call from the first moments a coup d'etat of the 25th of July 2021, please. Now, the present situation, a populist autocracy that demolished all the nascent democratic institutions, anything which has been built during those 10 years have been utterly demolished. All of them, institutions. So it killed political life at the pure sense of the word. There's no political life in Tunisia nowadays. So, and civil society. It used to be one of the most robust and solid civil societies in Tunisia because of this revolution. Unfortunately, now it's nothing. So there is, in addition to that, a situation of what we call a balance of incapacity or of weakness between what and what? Between those who hold power now, incapacity between an autocrat on one side who is unable to change anything, to bring prosperity, to change the socio-economic situation and the political crisis on one hand, and on the other hand, with an opposition also, a weak opposition, a divided opposition on the other side. Now also there is a clear multidimensional crisis. When I say multidimensional, I mean political, ethical, socio-economic, educational, and cultural crisis. At the short term, there is no clear short-term solution. In the near and medium terms, Qais Said may consolidate his power and will consolidate his power maybe. Possible re-election, he may be re-elected in 2024. Unless, this is very important because of the crisis I've been talking about, unless a sustained popular movement or a socio-political explosion erupts, which is very possible. With what's taking place now in Tunisia, you cannot imagine the crisis, the socio-economic crisis and the political crisis. Everything is possible. Okay, please go on. Bringing democracy, that is what imports for us, back. Only Tunisians can save Tunisia. Only elites can save their countries. Only people from that system can do what they know is better for their countries. So, rekindling the country's democracy will require, this is my opinion of course, I do believe it requires a long-term struggle. But at the same time, there are two trajectories. But they complement each other, two complementary trajectories. The first trajectory is an immediate one, what I call firefighting. What I mean by firefighting is you try to struggle for human rights and freedoms, which are getting assaulted every single day in Tunisia. So we need a daily firefighting against all of these assaults. The second trajectory, this is the important one, a medium to long-term trajectory founded on what? Founded on revisions. And this is what I called at the end today. If it is broken democracy, what we need to do is to draw lessons. That's what we need today. So, founded on revisions, autocritique, and drawing lessons. Please, go on. The revival of democracy also, another title, Finding Common Grounds. Common grounds. You remember I said there is a divide. There is polarization in Tunisia, which prevented any coming together, any, if you want, unity against what's happening in Tunisia. So we need finding common grounds. Based on what? Number one, based on the will and the capacity of political leaders to create an organized alternative. That's number one. Number two, these grounds are based on the ability of any such organized alternative and its leaders to muster real popular support. Because the problem nowadays in Tunisia is that because of that disconnection I spoke about at the beginning, the masses are totally disconnected with this opposition. They cannot adopt their causes, you know. So we need these leaders, these elite need to muster real popular support, a discourse with what? By adopting a discourse that focuses on people's concerns and public policies. And number three, these common grounds are based also on the ability to build an inclusive national reconciliation. Again, we go back here to the divide. So we need a national reconciliation and overcome historical glitches conflicts, historical conflicts, ideological polarization, and regional gaps. Please, Miss. The revival of democracy still building solid foundation. This is, I think, the most important slide in my presentation, because this is what we need if we want any change to happen. Mr. Kamal Ayed spoke in his very important speech about the battle of ideas. This is the battle of ideas. One of the greatest lessons we got from what happened in Tunisia, from this sliding back and from this coup, is we need to look forward for changing ideas, cultures. We need a culture of democracy. So, number one, approaching democracy not only as a competitive procedure, because what happened is that we thought that organizing election every time and now, so this is democracy. This is not enough. What we need also to look at this as institution building, as a rule of law, as and fair access to wealth. This is something maybe my friend here present from Tunisia, Ayman Boughanmi, won't share it with me. We had a discussion at a given moment. Maybe tomorrow we'll discuss this. So, number two, building solid foundation means reevaluating politics by expanding participation in the public debate. We make of politics something which concerns people, not only confine it to elites and a given class. So connecting elites with the general public is very, very important. Another point, building generations of Democrats. This is the battle of ideas. Building a generation of Democrats inculcated with the values of citizenship and the acceptance of difference. In Tunisia, we've been unable to accept the different. We have been unable to do that. So, moving thus from the state of belligerency to the culture of competition. Competition, not battle, not fight. And then establishing a politically and socially inclusive state that provides opportunities instead of consecrating licensing regimes. Ali Salman talks about this because he's concerned with economy especially. So here talking of opportunities, providing opportunities to people, not providing them with licenses. Okay, an economy of opportunities through, of course, through what? Through deep reforms, essentially the reform of administration and education. And the last point, reinforcing the fundamentals of the national independence, what you call sovereignty. Today, the discourse of Said, the populist autocracy is focusing on sovereignty and sovereignty and sovereignty, but this is just a discourse. We need to translate it into something really has a meaning. Yes, please, go on. Conclusion now. Whatever were the new elite's shortcomings in Tunisia, these were related to the heavy legacies of authoritarianism. 10 years in the life of people is nothing. 10 years is nothing. So we've been under authoritarianism for a long, long time. So one of the factors is this. The constraints of the exercise of power is in an extremely uncertain and polarized transitional context. This is the transitional context, full of skepticism, full of uncertainty, contingency. That's the context we've been living in. And in addition, as you may all know, an adverse regional context. Adverse to what? Adverse to democracy and liberty and freedoms and human rights. You all know that. And you all know what happened to the Arab Spring in this adverse regional context. The failure of the new political class to defend democracy. Here, the new class, which emerged after 2011, they failed to defend democracy as a national narrative. We need to transform democracy and freedom into a narrative. In Tunisia, we had the narrative of independence from colonialism, and no one can dare or dares to touch independence as a narrative. We need also to change democracy and freedom into a narrative among, not only among elites, among people as a whole. So democratization is not a linear process. I'm not pessimistic. I'm a politician, and now I'm specialized. I'm preparing a PhD in political science. I know what it means to be optimistic. So democratization is not a linear process. There is going forward and then backward and forward and backward, but we are going there. So reversing the coup d'etat at this moment now is a losing bet, but we have to work on a long-term strategies so that we reach something. And the last, I want to finish with this small conclusion. The power of a narrative, any narrative, lies in its deep-rootedness in people's culture and their willingness to accept it, then adopt it, and defend it against opposing impulses. If we succeed to make this, to make of democracy and freedom and liberty a narrative that everybody is able to defend, then we succeed. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you could feel the passion in her talk. As a fellow Tunisian, I actually second everything she said. I told you our speakers are much more than the short bios I provided. So before she became the Secretary of State, she suffered from dictatorship, and she also joined the Constitution Assembly, and she drafted the new constitution after the revolution in 2011 that our president now completely rejected. So thank you very much. Please prepare your questions for our Q&A session later. Now the floor is yours, Dr. Bijan.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. My presentation will be about state of democracy in Turkey from the perspective of rule of law. I will first begin with an analysis of rule of law, and then I will proceed to an analysis of the state of democracy and rule of law in Turkey. The principle of rule of law is considered to be one of the main pillars of democracy, liberal democracies. Furthermore, the independence of the judiciary is the backbone of the rule of law. In a sense, the rule of law means that citizens are subject only to the law, not to the whims of either a dictator or a democratic majority. Those who hold the political power must rule not on the basis of their arbitrary decisions, but on the basis of law. As Friedrich von Hayek puts it, quote, "Stripped of all technicalities, the rule of law means that government in its all actions is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand, rules which make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances and to plan one's individual's affairs on the basis of this knowledge," unquote. The main motive of limiting the government by law is to protect fundamental human rights. And this is a recent phenomenon. Throughout history, humanity has been subject to the arbitrary decisions of sultans or the kings. Even in democratic polities, such as ancient Athens, the individual's rights were not under protection against the decisions of majority. In a liberal democracy, the rule of law is sovereign and all citizens are bound by law and accountable to the independent courts. Francis Fukuyama sheds light on this feature of liberal democracy by distinguishing between the rule by law and rule of law. Accordingly, the rule by law corresponds to the commands of the ruler, while the rule of law refers to the fact that even the most powerful actors within a polity are bound by the law. Thus, we can find rule by law even in dictatorships, but rule of law exists only in liberal democracies. Democracies that are not based on the principle of the rule of law are variously called delegative democracy, illiberal democracy, and competitive authoritarianism. The laws in a liberal democracy are administered by an independent and impartial judiciary. This is the backbone of the principle of the rule of law, as I explained before. An independent judiciary ensures the separation of powers and serves to limit the government. In a country where the judiciary is under the control of the government, it is impossible to talk about the existence of rule of law, and it is impossible to protect human rights against the violations by the government. Now, after this brief introduction to the principle of rule of law, I would like to proceed to the state of rule of law in Turkey. The principle of rule of law has never been strong in Turkey. In fact, the weakness of the principle of rule of law can be traced back to the foundation of the Republic. The Turkish Republic was founded back in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his colleagues. And the Republic was modeled after it was based on an official ideology named Kemalism, right? And the main tenets of this ideology is secularism, and modeled after French laicism, and Turkish nationalism. Thus, the new state would be a secular Turkish state. It would be secular and it would be Turkish. All state institutions were designed to foster this aim of creating a modern, secular Turkish nation state. In this sense, judiciary was not an exemption. Judiciary had the role of securing also secularism and Turkishness of the new state. The judiciary, along with the military bureaucracy, was given the role of guarding the secular nation state against the ethnic and religious threats. This system is called tutelage system, vesayet system. And it was not possible to call, in this sense, Turkish judicial system as independent and impartial, given its role of preserving the secular nation state. This role of the judiciary was consolidated after 1960 and 1980 military interventions. Turkey experienced 2 military interventions in the 20th century, and they have consolidated the tutelage system. After 1960 coup, a new constitution was accepted, and the new constitution brought some novelties, such as the establishment of Constitutional Court and the foundation of High Council of Judges and High Council of Prosecutors. In 1982 Constitution, which was introduced after 1980 coup, a more strict tutelage system was introduced by the Kemalist system. The control by the military and judiciary over the state and society was secured. The game-changing event in Turkish politics occurred on November 3, 2002. On that day, the Justice and Development Party, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, won the general elections. This came as a shock to the tutelage system, because Justice and Development Party was formed by politicians with Islamic backgrounds. The tutelage system was alarmed. In order to ward off the threat coming from the tutelage system with its judicial and military components, the Justice and Development Party presented itself as a conservative democratic party whose leaders rejecting their Islamist past. This stance was also reflected in the Justice and Development Party's policies. At the beginning, the party was very reformist and pursued liberal democratic reforms with the purpose of making Turkey a full member of European Union. As a result of these reforms, Turkey was granted the status of official candidacy, and accession negotiations have started in 2005. However, the tutelage system in the first decade of Justice and Development Party rule tried to intervene with the government. First, during the election of the President Abdullah Gül, and later with the case of party closure against Justice and Development Party. In the first case, with the election of the President Abdullah Gül, he was supposed to be a president, elected president, and the military, just before his elections, issued an electronic ultimatum stating that a person with an Islamist background cannot be president of Turkey. But Justice and Development Party did not give in, and they proceeded to elect Abdullah Gül as the 11th president of Turkey. But during the process, they had great difficulties, but they succeeded in the end. Second intervention from the tutelage system came as a party closure case against Justice and Development Party, and the party barely survived that attack as well. The judicial dimension of the tutelage system was tackled by a referendum that took place on September 12, 2010. On that day, a referendum took place and 58% of the population voted in favor of the proposed changes, most of which were pro-democracy reforms. Most important changes were related to judiciary. One such constitutional amendment changed the structure of the High Council of the Judges and Prosecutors. The High Council of Judges and Prosecutors in the past consisted of 7 members who were elected from the members, among the members of high courts, like Court of Cassation and Council of State. And primary duty or mission of this council was to protect the tutelage system and the continuation of the state as it was founded on the Kemalist ideology. So the appointments of judges and prosecutors were observed by this commission, and they wanted to secure that always Kemalist judges and prosecutors would come to positions of power. With the amendment, the membership was increased to 22 and was made more pluralistic and accountable by ensuring that 10 members were elected by the votes of the judges and prosecutors from lower-ranking courts. Another important change regarding the structure of the judiciary was the reshaping of the Constitutional Court. Before the amendment, the court had 15 members, and with the amendment, 17 prime members with no reserve members were instituted, and the democratic character of the court was also increased by granting the Turkish Grand National Assembly the right to choose 3 members to the court. It is not misleading to say that by 2010, the tutelage system had been dismantled in Turkey. Justice and Development Party entered 2011 elections against this background. It won a great victory by getting 50% of the votes in 2011. The expectation was that government would attempt to solve the remaining problems with respect to democratization and human rights in Turkey. However, instead of improving human rights and rule of law standards, the Justice and Development Party has established its own hegemony over the judiciary. In other words, a civilian tutelage was constructed. This hegemony was not established overnight. It took several years and a great deal of struggle. One of the biggest struggles the Justice and Development Party has fought was against the Gülenists. The Justice and Development Party and the Gülenists are the group of people who were led by a former preacher named Fethullah Gülen residing in the United States since 2007, since 1997. And they are now considered to be a terrorist organization called Fethullahist Terror Organization since their involvement in the coup attempt in 2016. Justice and Development Party and the Gülenists had been closely allied against the Kemalist tutelage system. However, after the dismantlement of the tutelage system, they got into a power struggle among themselves. Another factor affecting the position of the Justice and Development Party was its attitude towards the Kurds and Kurdish problem. First in 2009 and then in 2013, steps were taken toward the solution of the Kurdish problem. But this process was seen as a tool to ensure the continuation of the Justice and Development Party rule rather than a permanent solution to the problem. Another turning point in Justice and Development Party's policy was the Gezi protests in 2013. The protests started in Istanbul's Taksim Square to stop an anti-environmental project and spread across the country after harsh reaction by the police. Then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan considered these protests a coup attempt against the government and used them as an excuse to crack down on the opposition and civil society. Finally, the coup attempt of 2016 played a crucial role in the establishment of an illiberal democracy in Turkey. In this presentation, I basically argue that Justice and Development Party, first with the help of Gülenists, and then without Gülenists, after their breakup, without the help of Gülenists, aimed to capture the judiciary. This was achieved first through the capture of High Council of Judges and Prosecutors. As I explained a few minutes ago, in 2010 there was a constitutional amendment and the structure of the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors was changed. And new elections were made, and Justice and Development Party in 2010, with the help of the Gülenists, captured the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors. From then on, they appointed new members to especially high courts.
Dr. 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left.
Yeah.
Thank you. The Court of Cassation, the Court of State of Council, and Constitutional Court. After the breakup, after the fallout between Gülenists and the government established new coalitions with new partners, such as nationalists, and they continued to dominate the higher echelons of judiciary. High courts were redesigned by the Justice and Development Party within 6 years through 4 law changes. Basically, the government, with law changes, increased the number of the members of the high courts and appointed new members close to his party, and then, with another law, decreased the numbers of the members of those courts, so dominating, packing these courts with the people affiliated and close to Justice and Development Party. This created a dependent and partial judiciary in Turkey. In conclusion, a competent and independent and impartial judiciary is fundamental to the rule of law, particularly in respect of the fair administration of justice and for the protection of human rights. It is therefore essential that a judicial system is able to guarantee the independence and effectiveness of its courts and judges. As presented in this paper, independence of the judiciary has always problematic in Turkey. Between 1923 and 2010, it was tutelage system that dominated the judiciary, and judiciary was not independent and impartial. However, after 2010, this time, Justice and Development Party created its own tutelage over the judiciary. Today, independent voices within the judiciary are silenced. There is a widespread atmosphere of fear among the judges and prosecutors. Those who dare to give decisions that annoy the political power are either dismissed from the office or transferred to another city. This creates an attitude of self-censorship among the judicial personnel in Turkey. Thus, it is impossible to speak about the existence of the rule of law in Turkey. In fact, this situation is reflected in the international indexes that measure the state of the rule of law across the world. According to World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, Turkey ranks 116th among 140 countries in 2022. This state of affairs places Turkey not among the constitutional liberal democracies, but among the illiberal democracies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bijan, for respecting the time. Actually, both of you respected the time. I'm sure this presentation will bring along a lot of interesting questions. We have one more presentation by Dr. Said Khan. Please proceed to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you again to ILN, especially to the organizers, Ali, co-founder Lord Kamal, of course, Madam Chair Tasneem, as well as Ahmed Bashir and others who have been involved in this. I will respectfully take a different tack than the two excellent presentations you've already heard from those who have been focusing on Muslim majority countries. As has been described already, my paper is entitled, "Can Muslims Save Democracy? Muslim Minority Communities Resisting Illiberalism." It's an interesting thing to consider in this day and age, especially coming from the United States, because the debates are almost singularly and uniquely focused on one man who served as the president already and is seeking office again. And within that, you can laugh, it's okay. And within that construct, the debate is oftentimes framed as whether democracy is under an existential threat. I'm sure that democracy in the United States is not, contra to some of the media pundits, going to lurch into dictatorship. But there's something far more nefarious and pernicious that's happening, and that is democracy lurching from being a liberal democracy to an illiberal one. So I suppose the choices then are between a stake through the heart of democracy or democracy dying with 1,000 paper cuts. It's still an open question to consider not only in the United States but elsewhere. Modern Western societies define themselves as the creators and bastions of liberalism, an ideology that centers the individual over the collective and espouses freedom as the paramount virtue. The key defining features of these societies are liberal democracy, rule of law, secularism, and a market economy. Of late, however, each of these features is facing some form of erosion. Market economies have been infected by neoliberal policies that corrode the free market, creating greater income disparity and inequality. Secularism is giving way to religious nationalism and religio-ethno-chauvinism. The rule of law is often flouted in proportion to one's power, positionality within society, or geopolitical spaces. And democracies across the world are challenged with the phenomenon of illiberalization. With the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, there was jubilation in the West that its values had conquered all possible alternatives. And for the third time already in the morning, you heard, of course, from His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as Dr. Bijan. Let me invoke for you yet again Francis Fukuyama, who in his 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, giddily heralded the victory of liberal democracy over communism, declaring that it would be the sole political model to prevail for the rest of human experience. Unfortunately, Fukuyama's elation was premature. China began its ascent, demonstrating economic dominance within a dictatorial model. Similarly, Russia has shown that authoritarian regimes cannot be discounted or dismissed. And the world's largest democracy, India, is descending into deeper illiberalization by the day under the administration of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the BJP party. These refutations of Fukuyama's thesis are important to note as much of how the world has changed toward illiberalism in the course of a mere 3 decades. Now, traditional liberal democracies are not immune to the forces of illiberalism. The United States, Great Britain, France, and other countries throughout the European Union have recently reassessed whether liberalism is indeed a cardinal virtue worth upholding. And I submit to you that there are several areas where we see this kind of erosion. Let me begin by talking about freedom of speech. Cancel culture, woke culture, and academic freedom being under attack along with truth in general. In the United States, for example, in the state of Florida, critical race theory as well as African American studies are under assault by the governor of the country or the state, as well as somebody who's seeking office as being the leader of the country, Ron DeSantis, having a chilling effect then on academic freedom. We find similarly in the area of freedom of press that there is an unprecedented threat to journalists. In India, as I mentioned before, we have the rather courageous Rana Ayub, who is constantly on the so-called hit list by the government and faces all kinds of threats, not only to herself, her life, but also her family and her career. Most recently, for example, she was applying for a visa to enter the United Kingdom for a literature festival. The Indian government, in fact, contacted the British High Commission to deny her a visa to the country to present at this festival. The British High Commission did not completely accede to the Indian government's request and demand, but they simply slow-walked her visa, so she was denied entry for the first weekend of the festival, but luckily she was able to present at the second. Also dealing with India and the United Kingdom, the BBC broadcast a documentary a few months ago that was highly critical of the Modi regime and his involvement in the 2002 pogroms in Gujarat. When the Indian government complained, they took their actions, number one, by raiding the BBC offices in Delhi under a trumped-up charge of tax evasion, and then also demanded, with the audacity that they have, that the BBC in fact pull the documentary completely. What was also quite telling was that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak did not defend the great institution of the BBC, nor did he defend the hallowed principle in democracies of the freedom of the press. So much for defense contracts. There's also, of course, the assault on the freedom of expression and privacy in the United States. This has manifested itself in last year's Supreme Court decision of Dobbs versus Jackson Reproductive Centers. But we also see this in France, of course, with the existential threat to French society, the hijab, and of course, more recently, the move to ban the abaya in state schools. Taking it to its most egregious, French politicians have included such statements as saying that Muslim women should make themselves available to French men. Also in the area of liberal democracy being under threat, we of course have the very cornerstone of democratic principles, and that is the right to vote. In the United States, voter suppression through various laws and new obstacles have become quite commonplace, but we find elsewhere the delaying of elections, The fact that in the United Kingdom, for example, there have been 5 prime ministers and only one of them was actually elected by the people in recent succession shows that the mechanisms of democracy are quite problematic. As I mentioned, there are other features when it comes to modern Western societies, including the market economy. This has become rather farcical when it comes to neoliberal policies, unprecedented wealth disparity and privation, and an uneven distribution of wealth. There is also, of course, the issue of secularism. In the United States, India, and elsewhere, the privileging of majority religions and the rise of religio-political nationalism. Now, in the past 2 decades, we have seen that Muslims in so many so-called liberal democracies have been subjected to securitization and added surveillance. The 9/11 attacks in the US and the 7/7 attacks in Great Britain, to which Lord Kamal alluded, have served as catalysts and justifications to implement a series of limitations on civil liberties and civil rights under the aegis of combating terrorism. I think it's important to also realize that the group that has been targeted or used as the so-called guinea pigs for many of these policies happen to be the Muslim minority communities, which then evokes a new title to consider these Muslims, the canaries in the coal mine. Now, some of you may be familiar with the metaphor that in the Industrial Revolution, in coal mines, it was common practice to send a canary in a cage down the mine shaft to test whether there were toxic vapors and gases there. If the canary came back dead, it meant that, of course, the fumes and the gases would be toxic to human consumption as well. If the canary came back alive, then it was appropriate to send the coal miners down and fend for themselves and extract the much-needed coal. Well, in that sense, Muslims have served that purpose rather well, and of course, without much surprise, many of these securitization policies and programs do not only apply to Muslim citizens, they also apply to societies at large, further eroding then liberal democracies in these locations. Well, when it comes to these ideas, then I suppose the question to ask ourselves is there a mechanism within Islam? Is there a mechanism within Muslim agency to try to combat this kind of illiberalism? Well, first, let's talk about what are the 2 challenges to humanity that illiberalism brings about. First is the ability for people to address, acknowledge, and adapt to cultural and civilizational pluralism. As technology, communications, and migration catalyze diverse engagement, the recognition of human and civil rights will similarly increase, all the while confronting the inevitable reactions of ethno-chauvinism, sectarianism, and tribalism. Current lurches toward hyper-nationalism, neo-fascism, and nativism are rejoinders to the post-national, transnational nature of illiberalism. In addition, illiberalism is facilitating the new rise of a new dimension of science in the case of artificial intelligence and automation at an unprecedented level. How much of this is going to then have a consequential impact on liberalization and whether democracy has the kinds of safeguards to prevent the exploitation and misuse and abuse of such technologies remains a very, very open question. With its current lurch toward Hindutva, India provides an additional assay for the phenomenon of religious nationalism, which then threatens not only the world's largest democracy, but the world's largest Muslim minority population of 200 million plus, which constitutes somewhere around 10% of the entire global Muslim community. The election of Narendra Modi in 2014 and the emergence of the Bharatiya Janata Party as the dominant political force in the Indian parliament have evoked a newfound departure for India's secular orientation, emblematic of the diverse nation's social and legal construction since its independence over 70 years ago. Yet Prime Minister Modi has asserted a robust Hindu narrative and allegations of a state-endorsed religio-chauvinist policy persist. Hindus constitute the overwhelming majority of India's population and certainly far from all support Modi or his promotion of Hindutva. But it is difficult to, at this point, ascertain how the tyranny of the majority can be reversed. While there does not appear to be a nexus between religious law and the indispensability of the state to procure it, religious law is nonetheless leveraged as a validator of the majority's demographic dominance as the essential marker in a nation's identity construct. Whether that is something that is being promulgated by New Delhi or Washington, D.C., again, is something that gives us pause when looking at how democracies operate today. Ironically, it is illiberalism that is expediting the promulgation of this notion as some nations, particularly those that are multicultural, seek an identity to assert and present in a world where lines of distinction are becoming increasingly more nebulous. As globalization, in that case, becomes far more pervasive, we find even the so-called stable democracies are suffering from a wobble when it comes to not only their identity, but sense of security, as well as sense of definition. How then can Muslims save democracy? I would suggest that there are really two ways to do so. One is to draw upon the experience in the kind of dangers and discontents of illiberalization and being targets of the violations of democratic principles and visions that so many Muslims living in minority status across the world face. Secondly, there's the recognition and application of intrinsic, democratically oriented Islamic principles. According to the scholar Abdulaziz Sachadina, Islam not only is compatible with democracy, it possesses the essential components of council, shura, and consensus, ijma, that democratic societies need. In addition, as a complete socio-political religious system, Islam can furnish, as Peter Berger, the sociologist, describes, a plausibility structure to provide society with a totalistic functional model that creates stability and flourishment. A functional society can only exist as reflected by how it treats its most vulnerable, its most weak, and its most marginalized. In that regard, many democracies fall short of that particular conceit, especially in the way that they treat Muslims. Along with shura and ijma, Islam, of course, also has the focus and primacy of adl, justice, as well as 5 principles that Ghazali describes: deen or faith, nafs, life, nasl, which is of course oftentimes described as lineage or progeny, but I would suggest it also means continuity, aql or intellect, and also mal or wealth. Muslim civic and political engagement can then go ahead and not only serve in the role of being canaries in the coal mine, but holding a mirror up to democracies as being, in many places, the second largest religious communities, to show where the fissures and the fault lines lie when it comes to the erosion of liberalism. Despite the calamitous trauma that has befallen the Islamicate in the past 200 years, with colonization and imperialism rupturing its efforts to engage in an organic interaction with Western emanating socio-political developments, including liberal democracies, Muslim societies are equipped with fundamental values and systems that can allow it to not only implement liberal democratic modalities within them, but also rectify existing dysfunctional democracies.
Professor Said, 5 minutes left.
I don't even need that, but thank you. Give me 5 seconds. A strong legal system affirms a strong commitment to the rule of law and justice, which Islam possesses. It also possesses a long-sustained tradition of pluralism and tolerance, with the dignity of the individual centering social formations. As illiberalism threatens democracies across the world, Islam and Muslims are well positioned, both within their respective locales and also as members of a 2 billion strong ummah, to protect and even save malfunctioning democracy from itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these insightful presentations. I really enjoyed them, and I'm sure that the rest of you did as well. Now we start the Q&A session. So I believe you have microphones at the back and at the front as well. So Dr. Hasnul Amin, you can start. Please, anyone asking questions, make sure to introduce yourself.
Can I start? Yeah, Dr. Farouk Musa here. I'm a founder and director of Islamic Renaissance Front in KL. I direct my question to Ms. Amin. Azus. I think we all understand that Tunisia is kind of, I would say, a catalyst for Arab Spring, right? So with when Bouazizi set himself ablaze in 2010, I think he set up this Arab Spring all over the Arab world. Yeah. Now it has turned to Arab Winter. So, but I think we still need to talk about it. Yeah. But I guess that for the rest of the audience as well, they should know that when the first president, this Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi, when he was in exile in the UK, Azam Tamimi, Dr. Azam Tamimi, this UK scholar, wrote a book, Rashid Ghanouchi, A Democrat Within Islamism. I'm sure you're aware of that book, right? We translated it into Malay, and it's available in this country, yeah, in Malay. I think Rashid Ghanouchi also written a book by himself, or a few books. One of it is, which is very important, is what is called as public liberties
public
in Islamic
freedoms
State.
in Islam.
Yeah, Islamic State, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, this particular book, I think, set the foundation of public liberties in the state, in the Islamic state, or civil state, if you want to call it. Means that the intellectual foundation was there. Intellectual foundation for a proper civil state is already there. So my question is, what led to the deterioration in this kind of public liberties in Tunisia, and what led to the rise of Kais Saied, your authoritarian president, as you mentioned just now, currently? So I think that's the question.
Can I? I prefer answering one by one.
It's not the format, so can we just take all of them, and then so that we can get the maximum of questions? Sorry, sir. Can you please introduce yourself again?
Dr. Farouk Musa, Islamic Renaissance Fund.
Thank you. Okay. This Dr. Husnul Amin.
Thank you so much. Dr. Husnul Amin, Professor, National Defense University, Islamabad. So I will be asking a very basic question, and that is premised on a brief description which I will add as well. Both Dr. Ramal and Dr. Saeed. What is the essential problem of Muslims with liberal democracy? The question is basic because it is premised on a long history. We were told that there is something wrong with this textual interpretation of religion. That's why. So we had several scholars who actually opened the text to a very liberal interpretation, and then, as Dr. Saeed just mentioned, that Islam and democracy are compatible and are not incompatible. And then, we had several experiences. So we tried like the AK Party's model, in which actually, combined the largest social movement, and they also tackled with the military as well. And then again, it returned to a very autocratic kind of democracy. We tried the same thing in Afghanistan, and we had this presidential form of government and elections supported by the US, because sometimes this question is raised that actually the US and the West is not supporting certain kinds of democratic models. Then we tested Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries. So there is something deeply wrong with the Muslims, either their psychology, either their culture, or either something is deeply has went wrong actually. And what is that?
Thank you, Doctor. Good luck with answering that question. Dr. Alatas, please make sure to summarize your comments and ask the questions right away so that we can get as many questions as possible. Dr. Alatas, right here. Yeah.
Thank you. Farid Alatas from National University of Singapore. I have a question for the whole panel. So let me put it this way. To me, it's not a question of whether Islam is compatible with democracy or whether Muslims can save democracy. To me, it's more a question of which interpretation of Islam becomes dominant in our society. Because for any view that Islam is compatible with democracy, there are contrary views, and it will never ever be settled. So it's really whether a democratic interpretation of Islam becomes dominant in society, and which groups in society will carry that interpretation and push for change. Would it be the masses? Would it be the dominant classes? That depends on whether democracy can succeed. So my question to all of you is, you've all spoken about the decline of democracy, the rise of illiberal democracy and authoritarianism. Now, what are the vested interests, I'd like to ask you, what are the vested interests in your societies which prevent or constitute obstacles to the rise of or the consolidation of democracy? Because its culture and ideas are not enough. You need strong groups to push for democratic change. So what are the vested interests that act as obstacles to this? Thank you.
Someone from the back, please. Yeah. Please make sure to introduce yourself. We only have 15 minutes left, so please make sure to ask the question.
I am Dr. Isharaf Hussain, President, Muslim Wall Research Center. I would like to draw attention, Mr. Dr. Professor Saeed Khan from USA. You are based on USA. You rightly emphasize on the present crisis within the Muslim minority countries. Particularly, you mentioned the situation of India, very prominent country of the world. I would like to ask a question to you. Do you think the Western democratic values, which is a champion to promote democratic values or liberal values around the world, particularly within the Muslim countries? Because for establishing or promoting Western democracy, USA is a champion or a leading country on the world. They are working to promote the democratic values in the Muslim countries, seriously active. For the reason, the Muslim countries are unable to promote their own values, which comes from the Islam. Islamic democratic values or Islamic political ideal is not working within the Muslim countries due to the Western influence. Western world is seriously active to create obstacle, to make problem so that Muslim cannot introduce its own ideal. There is a good example in Pakistan. Imran Khan was tried to introduce the model of Medina. So, do you think the promoting Western democracies values lead by Western world, particularly Western, is relevant for Muslim world? Is it able to save the Muslims or ordinary people around the world, particularly of the minority Muslims in the majority non-Muslim countries like India?
Thank you very much.
Just 1 minute. Because we have seen what happened the Muslims of Kashmir in India. What is the active rule of USA or Western world about the crisis and problem of Kashmir? They did not bother. They visited the Kashmir.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you because we have less than 15 minutes and we have a lineup of people who want to ask questions. If you have other comments, please, you can find the speakers later during lunch and continue the discussion. Please make sure to just ask the question right away. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Adnan. I am the coordinator from South Asia Students for Liberty. I have two questions. So first question is addressed to the first two speakers and other to Dr. Saeed. It is that, okay, what is it like to promote liberty as practicing Muslims or from an Islamic standpoint when, as you have described in your presentation, that that there is so much polarization between the secularist and the people and the Islamist. So what is it like to take a moderate position over there? And to Dr. Saeed, you mentioned a point about a lot of conservative US politicians opposing things like wokeism or critical race theory, and then even making it their election agenda. But I mean, a lot of them also say that it is also about paradox of tolerance here, that because there are certain, because the ideas in themselves are, they say, that are so destructive that if you try to promote those ideas, then that can overturn liberal democracy, because critical race theory, after all, has its origin in a neo-Marxist school called critical theory. So,
we got the point. Thank you. Next.
Okay. Thank you. My question is for...
Please introduce yourself first.
Hi, Siti Kamara, entrepreneur, former CEO for Wanita Berdaya Selangor. So I believe that my question is for Dr. Amil Azuz. And so I always believe that our problem with our religion is that too many men speak on behalf of everybody else. And today it was quite a refreshing panel because we have a 50% representation by really smart women on stage. Big round of applause for them. And visually, that gives me a lot of hope, to the point that I actually wrote an article based on Dr. Amil's sharing. And so the answer to your predicament lies in your last sentence, where you said that you need to build a hope narrative for Tunisia, and I think you got it. And I actually wrote an entire hope narrative for you on my iPad here. And
question, please.
The question is that, what is your version of that hope narrative, so that you can inspire us on that? Because as an outsider, working with the OIC and Islamic countries, I see Tunisia as the beacon of resilience and renaissance. I see so much hope that I could see in the next 50 years that if you could overcome your current challenges, that you could be that beacon. And I want to hear from you. What's your story on that hope?
Thank you very much.
Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. My name is Adriana. I'm a Malaysian citizen. I'm also a legal advisor for the National House Buyers Association at the moment. My question comes about from Dr. Bijan's speech just now, but my question is actually directed to Dr. Saeed. The rule of law is determined by a group of people. It's usually not coming down from the sky. How then can we separate the whims of personal interests of a person or group of persons from the interests and rights of the public at large? Thank you.
Thank you very much for making it concise and precise.
No, my question is about democracy in Tunisia.
Voice.
I have a theoretical comment. You stressed on one hand on elites and on the other hand on the role of culture. I think these two concepts are somehow incompatible with each other. Elitism and culturalism cannot be together for establishing a democracy. Is it not a paradox in your theory?
So the paradox between, can you repeat?
Elitism and culturalism.
And culturalism. Okay.
It's a theoretical point.
Is there a paradox between them? Okay. All right, we have 10 minutes to wrap up the session and answer the questions. They answered specific questions to specific speakers and then general questions. Who wants to start? Go ahead. No, you? You can try to address everything.
At the same time, okay? I'll start with, thank you very much for your questions, very important questions. But I still see that many of them could be reduced in one big question, to be frank. Okay, so let's start with Mr. Farouk Musa, I think that's your name, Dr. Farouk? Yes, okay. You asked about Mr. Ghanouchi's books, particularly. That's a very good question, you know. The problem, Mr. Farouk, is this gap we have between sometimes the intellect, theories, and reality. Mr. Ghanouchi is a good writer. He wrote lots of things, but when he got to power and to the challenges of power and the constraints of power, that's the big test. That's the big exam, which I personally think did not go right. Okay, that's the problem. How to turn those ideas, those idealistic ideas, into reality. The reality was very, very, very challenging and very difficult, and that was not easy to put to test or to put those ideas into. That was the problem with, and this is one of the things Mr. Ghanouchi was faced with young ladies and young men telling him, this is what we didn't see in your book. What you are doing is different. Okay, so this is this gap between ideals and ideas and reality. That's the gap. As for the next questions, I think all of them could be reduced in the question, what could be done? Mr. Husn al-Amin, Mr. Alatas, I think, Ms. Kamara, I think, all of you, what can be done? What should be done? So I remember here, where is it? Where's the question? Okay, I answered, part of the question was asked here, and I spoke about the culture, the question of culture. As far as the experience, I myself, as I told you, was an actor. I used to be a deputy in the Constituent Assembly, and I used to be a member of government, and I used to be a leading member in An-Nahda party. I used to be. So I know what was going on. So I do believe that we need political actors who not only have a will, the will itself is good, the intentions are good, but we need political actors who really turn those intentions and wills into real reforms. The problem in Tunisia, for example, is that we didn't have actors, political actors and economic actors and, let's say, elites who were able to turn policies into reality and reforms. When I say reforms, I mention here especially education, reforms of education, security system, the judiciary, and Bijan talked about the judiciary and the importance, the judiciary and the media. In Tunisia, one of the greatest obstacles of the revolution and the change in Tunisia was that we were unable to reform media. So that's why nothing went right. Because those who took hold of power after the revolution, those elites, those political actors, were not able to have the courage to turn, to go into reforms, into real and structural reforms, either in economy or in politics.
Thank you very much. Next.
I can briefly respond to your question. What are the vested interests? In the case of Turkey, I don't think the failure of democracy is related to Islam, but rather, as you alluded, it is related with the vested interests. In Turkey, the state is very big and controls a big economic part. And I believe that one of the reasons why Justice and Development Party under the leadership of Mr. Erdogan turned into a more authoritarian party is to capture the state and control this economic power. That's one of the, I think, vested interests that is in front of, as an obstacle in front of democratization in Turkey.
That's it?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I guess I've got 4 minutes. Yes. Is that okay? All right. I guess I could just end it by saying the answers are yes, no, or maybe. I don't think any of you will be happy with that. So I'm going to try, inshallah, to combine some of these because I think that there was a common thread among some of these. Dr. Husn al-Amin, Dr. Alatas, a gentleman who was in the back, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear your name because there was another mic that was going on. First of all, thank you, Dr. Husn al-Amin, for problematizing Muslims and saying we're the problem. I haven't heard that, since Bush said that about us. I think that there's an essential problem that Muslims have with liberal democracy is actually that they haven't fully and adequately decontextualize liberal democracy from its origin. We talk about liberal democracy as being sort of this universal and eternal phenomenon that applies to all people at all places. I don't think that's necessarily the problem with Muslims for misapplication. I think it's that they just didn't understand that it had a very specific historical, social, political origin, and that was the move from going from a Christian to a post-Christian Europe. And I think that if we don't understand that liberal democracy comes within that context of the Enlightenment, of the Protestant revolt, we then are misapplying it because it's how can I put this in IT terms? Its operating system is flawed. We're trying to go ahead and necessarily use iOS when we should be using necessarily a PC, or we don't understand how to interface with it. So I would say that that's one of the first challenges, that we have to then go ahead and understand how to decontextualize it, and then take from liberal democracy those aspects that we can apply that are compatible from an Islamic standpoint. Islam has done this before. We have actually taken concepts that even existed in the pre-Islamic era or from other civilizations like the Byzantine Empire. The tax system, for example, was implemented when we recognized that it was compatible. But we had to decontextualize it in the process. Dr. Alatas, I think that the point that you made is absolutely critical about which kind of Islam are we going to have. But I would suggest to you that if it is about the vox populi, if it is about the populist voice, then that society is going to decide which Islam it wants, and then it's going to decide whether democracy can fit within that. There are plenty of Muslim societies out there that have decided that democracy is something that they would prefer not to have. Perhaps it's too cumbersome, perhaps it requires a little bit too much effort to think about it. They love their monarchs, they love their single commodity economies and the wealth that it provides, and they're willing to go ahead and concede what we would consider to be important values to have: freedom of press, freedom of speech, and all, because they've mortgaged those for something more materialistically contingent. So I don't disagree with the point that you're making, and thank you for making that. The point regarding the U.S. and Kashmir, how long do you have? I would argue that the promotion of Western democratic values has actually been ruptured or superseded by corporate interests. And we see this happening across the board when it comes to Muslim countries that will take certain positions even when it comes to sacrificing, so to speak, the interests and the human rights of Muslims. And you can fill in the blank for any of those that you would like. Adriana, the point that you were asking regarding the rule of law when it comes to the whims of the personal individual versus the public at large. Where's Adriana? Okay, thank you for the question. I would actually look at Rousseau when he talks about the social contract and the general will. The whole notion of a society being made up of just simply individuals as islands unto itself is just, well, first of all, I don't think that was what liberalism intended. The model that Rousseau has about the general will and the social contract actually fits much more within the alignment of Islam, that there has to be some kind of a general consensus. I noticed over here that you drive on the left-hand side of the car. My individual instinct would be to drive on the other side of the road. I would find that would be problematic to go ahead and find space for me within the model that you're seeking as far as giving primacy to the individual. This is why I just take your public transport. I find it to be much easier than driving. And finally, Adnan, the question that you asked about, is it a fair assessment that conservatives have a point, that some of the whole cancel culture is also coming from the left? Absolutely. A pox on both of their houses. I mean, this is why I think that the whole notion of speech as a cornerstone of liberal democracy should be championed at the expense of both the zealots on the conservative and on the progressive side. I'm not a fan, especially as an academic, of having to worry about pronouns all day long and some of these other things that happen. But I will take one exception to this idea about this talking point of CRT being founded in neo-Marxism. What the hell does that even mean? Because I mean, this is something that is bashed in all the time. You have a problem, blame it on Marx. You have an issue with this, you blame it on Marx. Marx was simply commenting on a phenomenon that was happening in the 19th century, which he was absolutely right about. I think that this idea that everyone is going to now create a revolution based on what he and Engels said 150 years ago that's done. What we do have, though, is some of the kinds of commentaries about society and the way that it is composed and the way that people are exploited that actually do still have currency. It happens all the time. So I think that this idea of becoming reductive in the Twitterverse to 240 characters or 8 characters doesn't really help the debate, with all due respect.
Thank you very much. It's X, not Twitter, by the way. All right. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this panel. I can see that the discussions can continue later. So thank you very much for paying attention to this, and see you after lunch. Come on.
Thank you, Ms. Tasneem, for such a wonderful session. Thank you also to Dr. Baikan Sahin, Dr. Said Khan, and Ms. Amal Azuz for the enlightening discussion.